Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Jody and Evelyn and UTA Libraries for inviting me to give this talk. It's a wonderful opportunity to get to share some of the work that our students and faculty are doing. And thank you all for coming today. So I'm going to talk about breathing new life into Native American languages. But first I'm going to try and give you a historical overview and background in terms of what is going on and what the languages consist of, so you can get a sense of the what communities have gone through. At the point of contact in 1492, we had an incredibly diverse linguistic situation in the Americas. So here we have the North Americas, and the estimate is that there were nearly 300 distinct, mutually unintelligible languages spoken in Canada, what's now Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Now, this is not a completely visible map, but this uses color to highlight all the different language families. There's 58 distinct language families or language isolates spoken in North America. And if you make a comparison with Europe, we really have 3 language families in Europe, 4 if you count Turkic. So an incredible diversity in terms of the differences, significant linguistic differences in these language families. But that incredible diversity was threatened by a number of things that happened from 1492 onward. So I'd like to give you some context on endangerment of Native American languages. So how did we get to the position that we're in now? Well, conquest, colonization, and conflict just have dominated the history of Native Americas, with especially the United States government. From the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, what we saw in the 19th century especially was tremendous move by white settlers to the southeast and westward. And so what we have is battles with the Shawnee in Indiana, battles with the Navajo in Arizona, what's now Arizona and New Mexico, in Florida with the Seminole tribe, in the southeast with the Creek, Choctaws and Chickasaws, the Sioux in South Dakota. So this entire early part of the 19th century had lots of conflict, lots of military conflict with US soldiers, with white settlers, and with lots of different tribes in lots of different places throughout the US. And in 1830, President Andrew Jackson was able to get the Indian Removal Act passed. And the reason this is significant is because it basically authorized removal of Native Americans from their traditional homelands. And the goal was to have people be moved west of the Mississippi River. So you have this demarcation, if you think about the Mississippi River running on the east side and the west side, and the goal was to move Native peoples onto that west side. And so here's where we had things like the Trail of Tears, you had forced removal. In terms of the consequences of forced removal, what you see is people, and just removals in general, is you see people making a trek, a very long trek from their homeland, where they know the plants, where they know the animals, where they have ways of doing healing, where their ancestors are buried. And you have families, you have generations of families that are alive together, great-grandparents, grandparents, and children and their children, and they're forced to move to a new place, an unfamiliar place. And in doing so, not everyone made that trip. So many of the elders weren't able to make the journey, died along the way, and many of the youngest, the children, the infants, also were not able to make it. So what you have with removal is the destabilization of the Native American family unit. So we had forced conflict, we had military conflict, and then we moved into having removal, and then we ended up with something like this. So this is a map from Sam Noble that shows you some of the different removals from the southeast into Oklahoma. So Oklahoma, before it was a state, was known as Indian Territory, and tribes from throughout the US, the eastern and southeastern and Midwest, were moved into this state. And so you could see that the southeast was very strongly affected by this, but it wasn't just the southeast. You had the Sac and Fox moved. The Miami tribe went through several different stages of being removed. And every time you do that, what you're going to do is destabilize those interactions between family members, you're going to destabilize the community. And one of the aspects of community that's so important is language. So if we look at what Oklahoma looks like today, after removal, what we see is actually an incredibly diverse area. So we have 12 different language families represented on this map. And Oklahoma's been labeled a linguistic hotspot. And what that means is, well, it's a term that National Geographic's Enduring Voices project has coined. And hotspots are considered places that are incredibly diverse in terms of languages and very, very scarce in terms of linguistic resources on those languages. So lots of languages, but those languages don't have lots of materials collected, analyzed, and published for the languages. So as we moved out of removal into a new phase of history, what we saw in the latter part of the 19th century was a move towards forced cultural assimilation and linguistic assimilation. So in 1868, the Peace Commission report, it's quoted in a later report in that century, schools should be established, which children should be required to attend. Their barbarous dialects should be blotted out and the English language substituted. So this is a federal policy, this is a federal official basically laying out this campaign to eradicate native languages. So we have the military acts, which aren't necessarily directly relating to the language. But in the latter half of the 19th century, what you come to see is a series of reports and actions by federal policy and officers in the Army to move towards having forced cultural assimilation. In 1879, Carlisle Barracks became Carlisle Indian School. Richard Henry Pratt, who was in the Army, an officer in the Army, moved into developing this school. And I have a quote from him, which gives you another sense of what was going on in terms of the climate, the educational climate. A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him, save the man. So again, very strong language for assimilation and Americanization. They're called boarding schools, but I think the term school is really not an appropriate one. In the case of Carlisle, what you had were people being trained, a limited elementary education. And what you had was training in mechanical arts, agriculture, home economics. You had children that were trained to be domestics. So it's not what we might think of as a school that is the school in the kind of sense we think of for white settlers and their children. The legacy of these boarding schools was to take away what people came in with. Their traditions, their heritage, their culture, and their language. This is a picture of the same young man, Tom Torino. He's a Navajo young man, and this is what he looked like as he entered Carlisle boarding school. He had traditional garments, he had long hair, he was a bearer of traditional culture and language. And one of the things that happened in these Indian boarding schools is that was removed. So the hair was cut, the children were put into Americanized clothing, and the goal was to make these tribal members look like the conventional American at that point. So, in some states, you also saw that they didn't allow Indian children in public schools. Again, if we think about the history of forced removal, what we had with boarding schools was children being taken from their families. And again, you're destabilizing the Native American family unit. The consequences for that for language are just really very hard to deal with. The children at schools were typically from lots of different languages. So in a way, we are seeing an environment that mimics slave ships. When some of the slave traders brought people from Africa, they mixed the different languages, It's a way to avoid people from uprising. It's a way to reduce power because you basically eliminated a way for people to communicate with each other. So that same method was employed in boarding schools, children from lots of different language families. And there was punishment for children, in many cases, physical punishment, for speaking their language. And there's lots of stories of survivors from boarding schools and the impact that that had. If you think of your language as being the most personal thing that you have, the way you talk to your grandmother, the way you pray to your God, the way that you sing your children to sleep, and then being, at a very young age, having that taken away from you, you can see how that's going to have a major impact on destabilizing language in the home. And one of the keys for language survival is intergenerational transmission of language. So parents passing the language to their children, grandparents passing the language to their children, to their children, to their children. So you have these boarding schools that their goal was to assimilate and anglicize. And we ended up having a sort of, in the early 20th century, we had a couple of different periods in terms of repression and encouragement of native languages. Prior to 1927, the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, boarding schools, they did do forced assimilation. They did punish students for speaking their language. But there was this brief renaissance from 1933 to 1945 where John Collier encouraged language use, language revitalization, cultural revitalization. It's kind of interesting to note that that latter part of the years coincide with World War II. And one thing you might know about Native American languages is that a number of Native American languages were used for military purposes to basically serve as codes. So for example, the Navajo had a number of code talkers. What people did is they took their ordinary language and then concepts were used to encode military things. So bird might be, the word for bird in Navajo might be used to encode plane. So we actually had a number of different tribes, the Comanche, the Choctaw, the Creek, and languages, tribal languages that were used in the military to support U.S. military efforts and did so successfully. So we have 1945, and then we return to the boarding school model that's more repressive. But one of the things that happened in the 20th century was the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement had a lot of implications for language. One of the things that came out of civil rights legislation was language legislation and court cases that related to language, particularly for children who were in schools and spoke a language other than English. Laubach versus Nichols is one of those decisions. So as civil rights legislation moved through Congress, you also saw bilingual education legislation passing through Congress. And while much of our understanding and focus on that legislation may be directed towards Spanish and Latino communities, it actually had a very positive effect for Native American communities. So in the 70s and 1980s, you still had children coming into school speaking their home language. So in many, many cases, you had that. But once we start reaching the late 80s, that changed and that shifted. Now, what's interesting about the bilingual education legislation is it was used to do things like create writing systems where tribes might not have had a writing system before. It was used to create materials written in the language. It was used to train teachers. So, in comparison to the efforts that went on with other language communities in the US, it was not a large proportion of the funding, but it was significant. So I do a lot of work with the Dahna who are located in Arizona and in Sonora, Mexico. And they actually have lots of little stories that were written by people during that time period, published by San Simon School, and they're really great. But if you start to use these materials for the next generations of students, the students who come in speaking just English, what you find is they're actually no longer suitable. So the materials are great if what you have are children who are fluent in their home language, because what you're basically doing is teaching them literacy in their language, and then you're using those skills and those strengths in that language to build their English. But once you have children who come in speaking English, you need a different approach, because those materials are really about teaching literacy. So they end up actually being amazing documentation for the languages, but in fact, they are, as the language landscape shifted for Native American languages, then the need for those kinds of materials shifted, and the kinds of things that people needed was different. By the beginning of the 1990s, it really started to dawn on linguists, in the late part of the 80s, it really started to dawn on linguists that language loss was pretty intense. And what people were seeing were the loss of languages, the death of the final speakers of languages. And this realization was combined with the observation that this is a global situation. So many of the linguists who really worked to raise awareness and public awareness and awareness among linguists that endangered languages were endangered, that there was this thing called language endangerment, they were working with Native American communities. And so, for example, you had Akira Yamamoto, who was faculty then at Kansas, and he worked with a number of tribes in Oklahoma and in the Southwest. He worked with the Wallapai, who are in Arizona. And you had Ken Hale, who did tremendous work with lots of languages all across the world, but particularly with Native American languages. So you had people who were very involved. Nora England, who was working in Guatemala, where you had lots of repression of indigenous people, and with that you also see loss of language. So what you're seeing is people who are actively involved with communities raising this siren that we're losing our languages. Now, as a linguist, you can imagine if you study languages, then you've lost the object of your study. But to think about it in a more human context, what is our ethical responsibility as linguists to do something to reverse that? And there's a lot of models of research out there that don't necessarily have the researcher being an impartial person, like an advocacy or empowerment model. And so I'm going to show you some of the things that we've done in those ways. But the important thing is that language loss is global. This map is from UNESCO's World Atlas of Maps, World Atlas of Languages. And it lists languages in various categories, extinct, and then the red languages are critically endangered, so severely threatened languages. And this would be languages where there's no children, the speakers are very elderly, the future of that language is under threat. So you can see there's red dots everywhere. So every continent where we have had people is a continent where we see language loss. So language loss is global. There's lots of forces conspiring for this. Television, movie rentals. So in Arizona, before in the 80s, if you had TV and you were one of the tribes you were the Havasupai tribe living in the base of the Grand Canyon, you're not going to have cable TV. But as we started to see things like on the Navajo reservation, video trucks, so places where you could rent videos, then you see an inroad of mass media in English. Then you see satellite TV. In the internet, we see the internet being used by many majority languages. So there become lots of new domains, lots of digital domains, where the dominant language English is used. And that's true not just in the US, it's true worldwide. UNESCO has a way of assessing language vitality. And so if we look at some of the characteristics, we have things like the absolute number of speakers. But also we have the proportion of speakers. So within a given community, if you have 2,000 speakers, but the proportion of speakers is pretty high, so most of the people are speakers, then what you have is a more vital language than a language where you have that many speakers, but you have only half of them or a tenth of them being representing the overall population. Intergenerational language transmission, that is a key factor. Language in the home, that is the best way to learn a language in the home, using child-rearing practices, doing chores, doing daily activity, communicating in the language. Attitude, so the community attitudes towards their own language and also governmental and institutional attitudes and policies towards those languages. If you have a policy that is explicitly designed to extinguish languages, then that's going to have a big impact. You also see shifts in domains of language use. So while we Facebook, we text, we tweet, there are many people who do that actually in their own heritage language. So February 21st was Mother Language Day, and there was a global social media campaign to tweet in your mother language. And many of the people tweeting in those languages were tweeting in small languages. So for example, Yuchi, which has only a few speakers left, but has a number of people learning the language. So you have people who are using new domains. The Cherokee, you can Facebook in Cherokee, you can use Microsoft and Google Android, and you can text in Cherokee. So there's some new domains. You also see the responses to new domains. So do you let the dominant language take over? And another issue is what kind of materials are available in that language. If there aren't resources like dictionaries, it's going to be harder for you to try and take the language back. By the way, the UNESCO World Atlas lists every indigenous language in the United States as under threat. And there's really only 11 of them that are in the best vulnerable category. So they're all in varying degrees of problematic situations. This pie chart is showing you which languages are, what percentage of the languages we have data on are in good shape, and that would be the green languages. So if you're a language, like English is in the green zone. So a little bit less than half of the world's languages are in crisis. So we can see whether it's from extinct to just vulnerable, these languages are under threat. And if we look at census data, recent census data from our country, we see this map of speakers of Native North American languages. You see a dark blue zone, and the dark blue zone means 10,000 and over in terms of speakers. There's only one language, well actually I take that back. There's a couple of languages in that zone, but the most robust language is Navajo. Navajo is estimated having anywhere 100,000 speakers, maybe it's less, maybe it's as many as 120,000. I know a graduate student at University of New Mexico who is Navajo and doing her PhD in linguistics and looking at Navajo acquisition. And because we're on Facebook, I get to see when she posts a status update that she's found another 3-year-old who speaks Navajo. So she's looking, so there are still children on the Navajo reservation who are getting the language in the home. The places where you're seeing the strongest language retention are the places that are the most isolated. And there's a big digital divide in this country in places like the Four Corners area where the Navajo reservation is. The other blues segment, I think that's those darker blues on the bottom of Arizona should probably be the Yatam. Again, it's very, very remote. It's on the border with Mexico. When I go and do work there, there's lots of times I don't have any cell reception at all. There's only a few places I have cell reception. There's places on the reservation where people don't have running water. They don't have electricity. So it's important to kind of have a sense that there is a lifestyle, there is a disparate division in this country, and reservations show us something quite different than what we might experience in our life in Arlington. We can see there's also little pockets of light blue. So if you're green, it means there's less than 500 speakers. But the blues indicate that there's anywhere from 500 to 1,000 or 1,000 to 5,000. So the blues are giving us a little sense of things, but there's just pockets. So we can see up in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest, we can see the little inset of Alaska as having some nice blue pockets there. Up to the north of us in Oklahoma, there's some pockets of light blue. But overall, it's a stark picture. So how do we take this language loss and shift it into really language renewal and language reclamation? Well, one way we're doing that is by some of the projects that we have here at UTA in the Native American Languages Lab, which I direct. What we do is we focus on language projects with communities, typically in the Southwest. We've done things with communities in Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona. And we orient projects in a way that serve community needs. We do support for Native American language programs. We do on-site training. We do technology training. We've had workshops here at UTA. It's always really awesome when we have Cherokee or Arapaho spoken on campus. That's a really exciting thing for me and for, I think, our students. So we have lots of projects we do. Students at UTA and students from other places are really involved in these kinds of projects. So we have lots of ways in which students are able to fit into projects that are ongoing and can make a contribution. We're also very fortunate that the projects in the lab, many of them have been funded, including by National Science Foundation grants. Jody mentioned some of those that we have. We have almost $300,000 in grant support over the last few years. So that's very exciting. So when we talk about language revitalization, we're talking about the process of reversing language shift. So in the US, that's shift to English. And we're also talking about the process of language renewal. So when you renew your library book, you keep it for a little longer. When you renew your language, you keep it for a little longer. And if you're involved in language revitalization, some of the elements that are essential are things like the community desires and goals. So again, I would say I'm an agent. And if people have needs, they reach out and we talk about what we might do. But it's really up to other people in their community to sort of set their goals and know what they want. So there's lots of people outside that can be supportive of these goals. But local resources like people, expertise. Is there someone willing to take on direction of a language program in a tribe? You also have language resources. So the description, analysis, and documentation that might be out there for a language. As I mentioned, many of Oklahoma's languages are actually not very well documented. Many of them don't. We have this thing we call the Boasian Trilogy, the dictionary, grammar, and analyzed texts, bilingual text with some linguistic analysis. And many of these languages have none of those elements. So we've got a lot of challenges in the Oklahoma context. One of the ways we've supported what language communities are interested in doing is the Oklahoma Breath of Life workshops. This is actually from the 2010, the first Breath of Life, and it's Ashley McKeever in the center, and on either side of her are Tracy Moore and Rebecca Horst-Chief from the Osage Language Program. Ashley is one of our PhD students. She actually just finished, and she's got a tenure track job and doing great. So it's really nice to be able to see that the students involved in these projects are able to also go on to success in lots of different professional ways. This Breath of Life model was pioneered in California. The Advocates for Indigenous California Language Survival paired up with Leanne Hinton, a linguist at the University of California at Berkeley, where Berkeley had a very long tradition of describing native languages. They have an amazing archive, especially of California languages. There were lots of linguists engaged and anthropologists engaged in this research. But there are many barriers for Indigenous people in trying to get access to those materials. Sometimes it might just be an archivist saying, sorry, right? Just shutting the door. People may be told they may show up and be told they have to have an appointment. There's all sorts of challenges out there to getting access to what's people's heritage materials. And so this was a very, at the time, I think, pioneering tribal academic partnership. And it really shows us some of the things that can happen when grassroots Indigenous organizations like ACLS pairs up with Berkeley or another university. But the goal in California, you had tremendously diverse languages. Probably you know about California. There's lots of nice things there, right? There's mountains, there's Pacific Ocean, there's lakes, there's everything. Lots of different kinds of acorns. There's tremendous natural resources in California, and what we also see is tremendous linguistic diversity in California. But California languages were decimated by, in particular, the Spanish missions. And that actually had a very severe effect. And so California languages are all in states of peril, and in many cases haven't had speakers for a couple of generations. So the Breath of Life model is designed to support community members who don't have a resource like a fluent speaker to go to. And what they have is the notes of the linguist. They have the documentation. Maybe it's journal articles. Maybe it's something more. But those are hard materials. So I have actually my undergraduates in my 3000 level class are doing a little documentation project, and they have to find academic sources on languages. And then they have to try and decode them. And it's a hard thing to do. And if you look at older stuff, it's very hard. You have to know what system someone used when they were transcribing it. Linguists use this International Phonetic Alphabet, but not everyone uses that. A lot of people working on American Indian languages did a sort of modification of that. Other people had their own system. So Breath of Life is designed to basically give linguistic training and to do it in a way where you bring people into the archives and you give them access to their heritage materials. And those materials aren't just language notes. They're also cultural objects like baskets. So we were able to do, in 2010, 12, and 14, these week-long workshops where we brought community members from all over Oklahoma to University of Oklahoma. This is the Sam Noble Oklahoma Museum of Natural History, and that's where the Breath of Life workshops occurred. We've done some innovation and expansion to this model. We've innovated with doing databasing as a way to learn linguistics and reinforce linguistic concepts. But the idea is we work with participants and help them learn enough linguistics so they can unlock and access the materials in their language. This is a joint effort, collaboration with Mary Lynn, who was at that point at the University of Oklahoma, and myself. And we've had lots of opportunities for UTA students and University of Oklahoma students to be involved as mentors. So perhaps you might ask, why use archival materials? What we have pictured here is a page from the Sam Noble collection. It's some Osage notes. Well, first of all, you might find personal narratives and tribal historical narratives that can be used to develop teaching materials. And actually, you can find materials that are incredibly personal to people. I've had opportunities where I've played a recording I had access to through an archive, and people said, oh, that's my great uncle. So these are really personal things as well, and family histories and tribal histories. You can find stories that may not be told anymore. So there are, in a number of communities, there are origin stories that might be told over multiple nights, and there might not be anyone who knows that 7-night sequence anymore. Then people may know some parts of it. And if it was in the archives, then you have a full version, and maybe someone will want to relearn it. You find out about older ways of doing things. Language and culture are recorded in there. Ways of speaking. Were men and women recorded as speaking differently? There's so many materials and things that you can find in archives. The model draws on having a mentor. And we've been very excited because in this Oklahoma Breath of Life workshop, we've had students consistently the last two times who have been the mentors. And each language group has a mentor, a linguistics mentor. And we have pictured here on the left side, Samantha Cornelius, one of our PhD students, working with the Wyandotte group, Richard Zane Smith, and then it was who she worked with. We have another participant from level 1 Wyandotte. It's an Iroquoian language related to Mohawk and Cherokee. And part of the reason we were able to, we put Samantha in this group is because she had taken our year-long field method sequence where we worked on Cherokee. And so she had this experience of working with a related language that she could draw on to help Richard understand the linguistic materials, which is really not very much on this language. So language teams are essential. Each language has a mentor, and we've developed it into having a 2-level model. So here we have some participants and their mentors from 2012. On the left, we have Lori McLean Pierce she worked with the Alabama group, which was the 2 participants had never done anything with their language. It was their first exposure, so it was a really amazing thing for them. And the other picture is Nathan Ebersole, and he worked with the Shawnee group. We have participants from the 3 different Shawnee tribes in Oklahoma. So learning linguistics is this tool for unlocking the archival materials, the linguistic materials on the language. And here I have my collaborator, Mary Lynn, teaching one of the level 2 courses back in May. Participants also learn to use archives. There's lots of different ways to use archives. If you've never been in an archive, it's lots of fun. You can get lost in lots of things. So having some experience knowing how to do that is valuable. People also visit the collection. So this is the ball stick collection. In 2012, we had participants who were interested in ribbon work. So there's physical objects from related tribes or from participating tribes. And there's a state-of-the-art recording studio at Sam Noble, so we're able to make new resources. We've integrated these databases and dictionary projects, so we've been able to individualize little starter kit language databases for languages that participate. Lots of communities are interested in having these sort of online talking dictionaries where they can see the word, how it's written, and then hear it. Lots of fun. It's a very intense week, but we play some of the traditional games and cultural activities. We have Nathan and another grad student, Libby, here playing lacrosse. And the end of the week is final projects. And what people do is they work throughout, you have homework every day, and you have a final project due at the end of the week. So it is a very intense time. You're sort of working 24 hours a day. And on the last day, everybody shares their project. So it's a great way to get inspiration and ideas and mutual support. This was Terry Parton. She's now president of the Wichita affiliated tribes. Another thing we see is lots of people going on, both the students and the community members, into leadership roles. So here was our 2010 class, 2012, and 2014. Some of the positive outcomes include that we trained 35 indigenous people from 12 distinct indigenous languages. 2 undergraduates, 17 graduate students, and 1 community have been linguistic partners or mentors. Participants have created new documentation, new recordings on their language, new teaching materials. We've been able at UTA to build a mobile laptop lab, and so we can do on-site technology training, and that's a great thing we've been able to do thanks to support from the NSF. And also at UTA, we've created database shells for 30 different indigenous languages, 26 of them from Oklahoma. So people can have training materials on their own language, so that's kind of fun. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about revitalization and documenting languages. And when we talk about, language documentation, well, we have kind of different things we divide up in linguistics. So revitalization is about reversing the tide of shift. Description is basically trying to get those 3 things I talked about, the dictionary, the text, the grammar. So a record of the language, the rules, the constructions, examples. But language documentation is a bigger thing, so description is included in that, but it's really the linguistic and cultural practices and language practices of the community. And these may be things like prayers, ceremonial speeches, recipes, all kinds of things. We've been able to develop a collaboration between UT Arlington and the Chickasaw Language Revitalization Program, and here's my collaborator, Josh Hinson. And what we've been doing is thinking about how to integrate revitalization, documentation, and pedagogy, teaching language. We've had it, we conceptualize this as everything feeding into this sort of cycle. So we think about what we want to help learners do, what learners are struggling with, and we try to collect more examples of that with the speakers that remain. Chickasaw is a Muskogean language. It's severely endangered. Best estimates are that there's 60 to 65 speakers remaining. There's no one under the age of 60. There's about 25 or so who participate in language committee activities and other things with the program. So we view training and revitalization, feeding into the documentation, then we do analysis, and we think about how to take that analysis, but then create things that are helpful for learners. So one of the ways we've done this is what we call the Chickasaw Narrative Boot Camps. Here we have Nathan again. This was in 2013, and what we've done is basically we have 2 days, and we bring together elder speakers, and we pair them with a student, or we pair them with a Chickasaw program staff member, and we do on-site recording, on-site transcription, on-site translation. What's really great about this is it's terrific for the students and for the staff program participants because they're developing an ear for transcription. If you're a learner of Chickasaw and you're listening to these stories told in Chickasaw over and over and over again, you're going to get some stuff about the language. For the students participating, it's a safe environment to do fieldwork in a very limited context with supervision, but independence. And it facilitates learning technology for language documentation. Part of our project is also involved drawing on the expertise of a linguist who's worked on Chickasaw for 40 years, Pam Monroe. So one of the things this does is it builds expertise in the Chickasaw program. This is Brandon White Eagle. He's a language program staff member, and he's also a learner, and he is involved in lots of activities. And here he is with Weldon Folsom, who is a wonderful speaker of Chickasaw. So Brandon's one of our transcribers. We train student linguists. So here's an OU student. Oh, is that a wasp?
Yes, unfortunately.
How do you get a wasp up here? Sorry. So we train student linguists. So here we have in the left picture an OU student, Juliet Morgan, and the rightmost picture, our UTA student, Lori, each working with fluent speakers of Chickasaw, Hannah Pittman and Joanne Ellis. And so they're getting hands-on experience, not just working the language, but in actually working with speakers of some language. We're again able to draw on the expertise of Chickasaw elder Catherine Willman, who's the oldest living speaker of Chickasaw, and linguist Pam Monroe. The elders have fun. They really enjoy themselves. We do these 2-day book camps, and then it is just exhausting for us. We're tired. We're very tired. And at the end of the first one, the elders are all like, oh, we want to do this again, and we want to do it longer for more days. And we're all like, I don't think we have energy for that. So, but it's a very fun opportunity for participants, whether they're the elder speakers or the students or staff members, to really bring everyone together, have people do hands-on things. It's refreshing the language experience for the elders. If you are one of 60 speakers of a language, odds are you may not be using the language on a daily basis. So what we do is we brainstorm at the beginning of the day. We listen to some examples of stories to kind of get some excitement going. It's always very fun for the speakers to hear stories in their language. And we kind of have little tables, and there's a couple of speakers at every table, and then they brainstorm. So what's nice is they have another speaker, so if they feel like, oh, this student working with me doesn't know Chickasaw, I don't feel comfortable telling a story in Chickasaw, I can't get into my groove, right? We have another speaker there, they have fun, they brainstorm. It seems like we have themes that emerge. So when we played one story that was about roping a calf and trying to ride a calf like a horse. It's a very funny story. But then we ended up having a lot of animal stories that group. So we use these to spark people's energy on the language. And then we take the data that we create and we mobilize it to support language revitalization. So we've been doing listener workshops. So I've taken the lead on designing these workshops. As Jody mentioned, a phonologist. I'm interested in sound systems. And so thinking about, because I'm up there and I see what learners struggle with, or I ask learners, what are you having trouble with? Or, what's going on? And then we think about how to design listener workshops. And we use word lists, we use stories, we use other materials, and it's a way of indirectly teaching the linguistics of their language without actually using jargon and being very actually technical term free. So if I've got any phonologists in the audience or linguists in the audience, which I know I do, right, we can teach them allophones without saying allophones or even mentioning scary terms like that. So, but the idea behind these workshops is how is it we can take learners and help them move to intermediate or advanced levels. There's very little we know really about learning endangered languages. And so, if you want your language to survive, which the Chickasaw program does, then making sure people can learn the language and can be better learners, it's essential. Again, with these workshops, so they're listener workshops, they're really oriented towards learners, but the elders come. The elders actually seem to enjoy these workshops. In the one we did one in February. This is the pictures here from the February one. We had about 34 people who were there, and of those, we had 14 fluent speakers of Chickasaw. So, it's a blast. They have a lot of fun. Here's the picture. We kind of have a little spiel we go through, and we have lots of examples and lots of audio, but we have speakers there. So we have examples, and then speakers pitch in, or we can talk about variation. So it's a really amazing environment. It's pretty incredible, actually, that we're able to get 14 out of the 60 or so elders really, coming and participating and enjoying it. It also shows our collaboration. It shows, first of all, that UTA gives back. So it's not like I just come up and collect data, but I go and I do things for the program. And so that's a very important thing. It's very important, I think, for the elders to see that we work together and to see kind of some of the things that we do that are helpful. The learners don't really say much at these discussions, but they're very attentive. So if you've ever taught, you can see when people are attentive and listening and nodding and things like that. And that's some of the things we see for learners. The fluent speakers are actually the real chatty ones during these workshops, which is great because we have fluent speakers enjoying themselves around the language. So what we're doing is we're creating opportunities for language use. We're creating opportunities for language use not just with these wonderful fluent speakers, but for intergenerational relationships. So if we think about what removal did, if we think about what the boarding schools did, what we're now seeing is a way to restore intergenerational transmission of language, intergenerational relationships. So it's a great way for the speakers who are typically, 50s, 40s, the learners who are 50s, 40s, and younger to get to interact with elders. We have take-homes for participants. Again, we want to encourage them. While you're in the shower, think in the language, say things out loud in the language, use the language. So this is our 2015 group. It was it's an amazing group, but you can also see what situation we're dealing with. You can see how fragile some of these elders are. So, this was when I was there. Jerry's in a wheelchair. He's been going through dialysis. Geneva's now on a walker. It's a group of people that are amazing in terms of they're basically spending their golden years working on their language and keeping their language alive. So it's just pretty amazing to be able to have that opportunity. In terms of positive outcomes, we're creating new documentation of a severely endangered language. And we're creating new speakers, which are essential for the language's survival. We're building skills and we're building capacity among the Chickasaw program staff, among their community teachers. And also, we're heightening their meta-linguistic awareness of the language, which we hope will help them learn. We're increasing opportunities for intergenerational experiences, and the language is the reason to do that. And for students, we're training them in ethical models of how to work with minority communities. So, they're getting hands-on work in language revitalization and documentation. They're seeing that it's about relationships, and they're seeing it's about giving back. So that's a really great thing as well for the students that are involved. So to kind of conclude things and draw things up, those are just two examples of the kinds of projects that we've been doing at the Native American Languages Lab. This is another one. This is COLANG 2014, the Institute on Collaborative Language Research. It's an international language documentation and revitalization institute. We hosted it at UTA in June and July. We had nearly 200 people who were here as participants, who were instructors, or who were public speakers. And that's not counting. We had a lot of public events, Navajo Star Wars. I know some of you were at that. All right, so we had a lot of events for the public to come. We've been doing a project with Cherokee Nation thanks to UTA's Sustainability Fund and creating Cherokee documentation in the language about ecological knowledge. We've got an annual revitalization workshop that's every April that students get to participate in. We have an Alabama project, a project on the Alabama language that came out of COLANG, and that's the Alabama Coshada Tribe of Texas. So we're actually also making contributions here in the state. So we have a tremendous amount of work we're doing in terms of workshops, facilitating both sides of things, whether it's creating quality documentation or finding ways for that documentation to be mobilized to maintain the language. We've got lots of students participating, and they're not just from UTA, they're from other institutions as well. So what we're seeing in terms of the final products is that it's possible to energetically work with indigenous communities to document, maintain, and revitalize their languages. So we can have that whole circle of the activities involved that are key for these communities. Training is a major cornerstone of this approach, and in empowerment or participatory models, that is often a key element. So this is a community language-based research design, and to draw from a quote by Tchaikovsky-Higgins, it assumes that knowledge can and should be constructed for, with, and by community members, and that it is therefore not merely or primarily for linguists. So it's a very human side of language work. There's transfer of knowledge to the involved communities, and actually to other communities as well. So I did some work with the Sac and Fox language department. They had 2 apprentices learning the language, and I went up and did some training for them. And now that we're down the line, one of the apprentices was in our November workshop and doing his own training. So we're able to see growth in the region. One of our 2012 Breath of Life participants is on the leadership board of the Oklahoma Native Language Association. So it's a great way to see capacity building and the cultivation of leadership skills among both community members and students. I would say, and I think I am right, that it is a unique opportunity found in no other linguistic program in the country, and probably beyond that as well, for undergraduate and graduate linguistic students to participate firsthand in community-based research language projects. They're acquiring skills in language documentation and revitalization in case they want to do this work. It's generating research in conferences and publications, and it's generating research grants. So we're clearly finding a way that this outreach shows itself to be an essential component of the research model. And advocacy is an important part as well. So we're raising awareness for endangered languages, especially Native American languages, which are part of our country's history. They are spoken nowhere else in the world. And if we lose them, and when we, should that day come, have nothing left, it will be on us. We've created the policies, we've done the action. So it's part of our heritage, just like it's part of the tribe's individual heritage. But language is more than language. It's really important to consider the human side of language, how it keeps us whole, healthy, how language in these projects is really restoring humanity to people who were robbed of it because of the many processes of conquest, colonization, and boarding schools. So we've seen how these kinds of actions can destabilize minority communities like the Native American tribes we've talked about. So connecting with that tribal language and that tribal culture, we're actually starting to see research come out that shows that those have positive impact in terms of health outcomes. So there was a study at the University of Alberta that looked at diabetes rates, and where people were connected with their language and culture, they had lower diabetes rates. We're seeing Native youth who are involved in programs that give them access to their language and culture. They have better test scores. They have higher educational success rates. We all benefit if we have a healthy, well-educated citizenship. So in closing, I just want to do a few acknowledgments. The Oklahoma Breath of Life co-director, Mary Lynn, and our National Science Foundation grants for the Breath of Life workshop and documentation project. And also another grant that she had that was funded some of these activities. I'd like to thank the Chickasaw Language Revitalization Program Director, Josh Hinson, and staff members Joanne Ellis and Stan Smith, as well as Chickasaw Language Committee members and speakers, Jerry Matachi, Willem Folsom, Hannah Pittman, Vera Timms, Lorraine Frazier, Pauline Brown, Geneva Holman, Rose Jefferson, Carlin Thomas, and Phyllis Laddie, and Emma McLeod. I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation for funding the Chickasaw work, and I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation for the grant on COLANG. And I'd also like to thank the many UTA organizations, including UTA libraries, that provided partnerships or support or sponsorship for this event on campus. Actually, we were able to have several events here as an in-kind donation thanks to the library. And I'd also like to thank the UTA libraries and Jody and Evelyn for inviting me here to speak. Thank you.
So we're happy to have you guys pose any questions you might like to ask. Just probably have time for a couple, and then we would love for you to stay for our reception that's sponsored by the Phi Kappa Phi Honor Society.
Carl?
This is great work and very noble work. I have to wonder, what exactly do you mean by use the word language revitalization, and how do you measure the success of revitalization?
Well, I think I would say that you can define your own success. And that with language revitalization, if we continue to think of it as not necessarily being about language, but about what happens in a community when connection is restored to the language, and the positive outcomes that come in education, health, a sense of confidence and success among Native youth, for example. So language revitalization is really about a web of things that really, it's not just about language. So, you know, in order to commit to becoming a fluent speaker of a language like Chickasaw, you have to commit really your heart and a lot of your life. There's a lot of enrichment programs. So there's a kids language club. There are community classes that are, you know, every week that people can drop in on. But the main way in which fluent speakers are developed in Oklahoma is through the Master Apprentice Program, which was again developed in California with the Berkeley Eagles collaboration. And what it does is, for languages where there's very few speakers remaining, the key, so, you know, obviously infants and children are the best language learners, right? But if you are a 70-year-old, you may not be wanting to spend 40 hours a week with a bunch of 5-year-olds. So the more appropriate model that people have used is this master apprentice, where you have the elder fluent speaker, who is the master, and the apprentice is the language learner. And the goal is to use just the language in a communicative sense. Actually, you can go hang out at the master's house and do dishes and talk as you're doing dishes and doing chores and doing daily activities that you could then go home and use the language in for that. So there are people that, you know, the ideal is 10 hours a week for master apprentice. And the program that's been the most successful in Oklahoma is the Sac and Fox, the Sauk language department, where they have been really amazing at creating intermediate and advanced level speakers through that method. So, but again, if we think about the range of things that comes with language revitalization, and those things being very positive, you know, I don't know that we want to define it necessarily as success means you've developed a bunch of fluent speakers. Mm-hmm.
Is it fair to say that, like, in a typical American culture, like these ideological state apparatuses like education and that are used for, like, to, you know, teach people, like, is it fair to say that they use them to become like repressive state apparatuses to kind of like, I mean, really force these people out of their culture? I have kind of a few questions. Like, and was it so repressive that there was like no opposition? Because I think of like Zikala Sa, you know, like she absolutely just, you know, fold. I mean, she really fought as much as she could and wrote several books on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think in really, especially contemporary society, what we're seeing a lot is a movement to indigenize and decolonize education. And really, the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma is actually doing amazing things. So the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma had not had fluent speakers in several generations. And a gentleman named Darrell Baldwin found a list in his attic from his grandfather of words and wanted to learn his language and sought to learn his language. He got a master's degree in linguistics from Montana to learn his language. And, you know, he sort of did it on his own, and it's a struggle. It's the Algonquian language, which I consider to be kind of very intense. And so he's looking at this linguistic documentation, and really what ended up happening is this gentleman, David Costa, did his dissertation in Miami, and they kind of have formed a collaboration. Coming out of that collaboration, Darrell's family used the language. So Darrell began to use it in the home. They had a new batch of kids. So they had their older kids, and then they had some younger kids. And those younger kids, that's what they grew up speaking. That was used in the home. Actually, I mentioned that we had one indigenous mentor. That was actually Darrell's son, Jared. Jared's an amazing young man. He's 22, 23. There's a partnership between Miami University of Ohio and Miami Nation. Because the Miami University of Ohio recognizes the contributions of the Miami tribe, and so they actually have this amazing tribal university partnership that involves scholarships for Miami tribal members. And they've got a great Miami curriculum in terms of language, history, and what you're doing is you're cultivating that next generation of leaders, and they're going to have the sense of that value of language. So Jared got his degree at Miami University. In the years that have come since, what you've seen is publications taking texts from the Miami language on the natural world. So bringing in that ecology and that sense of place and all sorts of things that were a part of the life before all these removals. And actually, there's just a study that came out from the tribe showing higher success rates for their students who are involved in these programs. They do summer camps, in the language camps in the summer. They do all kinds of things. And so what you actually see is many members of the community partaking in the language and having ownership and designing their education the way they want it to be, using their principles, the Miami way of thought. And I think that's another thing about language. It's not like you just stick the language in there and it's gonna do everything for you. What the language does is it's part of something. It's part of a community, but it's also part of a worldview. It's a part of a system of knowledge and a philosophy about the world. So there's a lot there. And so if you just take a sort of Western school model and that's how you teach the language, people might not be so surprised that you're not getting the results you would like to get. I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
So thank you again, Dr. Fitzgerald, for coming and speaking with us today. Thank you all for coming and attending the talk. Please stay for our reception that is sponsored by FOF, and let's thank Dr.